There's a specific kind of game that feels almost extinct now. Games that don't just challenge you mechanically, but emotionally. Games that make exploration feel dangerous. Worlds that are melancholic, hostile, and quietly tragic. The kind of games that expect you to pay attention. For many players, Alundra represents that feeling perfectly. And strangely enough, so does Evil Tonight. At first glance, these games seem completely different. Alundra is an action RPG, while Evil Tonight is a survival horror. Different genres, different combat systems, different pacing, but emotionally, they share the same DNA. Both games create the feeling of being trapped inside a dangerous world that remembers suffering. And that's why Evil Tonight scratches an itch that I have been trying to rediscover for years. I am Existential Thinker, and today we're looking at why these two games feel spiritually connected and how Evil Tonight revives a style of game design that modern games rarely pursue anymore. One of the biggest similarities between Alundra and Evil Tonight is how they treat exploration. Modern games usually prioritize convenience, large maps, quest markers, constant guidance, navigation systems designed to remove uncertainty. But Alundra never worked that way. Its villages, dungeons, and dreamscapes demanded attention. You had to observe your environment carefully, memorize layouts, notice clues, understand geography. Exploration felt tense because the game trusted the player to figure things out. And Evil Tonight recreates that exact rhythm. The academy setting slowly becomes familiar through repetition rather than guidance. There's very little handholding, no constant reminders telling you exactly where to go. You learn the environment naturally, room by room, hallway by hallway, and that creates the exact same emotional tension Alundra had. Where am I? Did I miss something important? Can I survive the next room? Do I have enough healing items? That uncertainty matters because uncertainty creates vulnerability. The player becomes mentally engaged with the world instead of simply following instructions. Modern games often smooth away that friction. Evil Tonight keeps it intact, and that old school harshness immediately feels familiar to people who grew up with games like Alundra. What many people remember most about Alundra isn't actually the puzzles, it's the sadness. The village of Inoa feels emotionally exhausted. Characters are haunted by fear, grief, guilt, and despair. Dreams become manifestations of trauma. People suffer constantly, and beneath the adventurous surface, the game feels deeply tragic. That emotional heaviness is a huge part why Alundra stayed with people. And Evil Tonight taps into that same lonely atmosphere. The protagonist, Sylvia, explores spaces that feel haunted not just by monsters, but by emotional residue. Abandoned hallways, fragmented memories, rooms that feel frozen by suffering. The horror comes less from gore and more from emotional aftermath. That overlap is extremely important because both games treat spaces as psychologically damaged. The environments themselves feel wounded, and in both games, the protagonist functions almost like a spiritual cleanser. Someone moving through corrupted places, trying to heal what remains. That is very Alundra, not literally in story structure, but emotionally. Both games create worlds where suffering lingers in architecture, where trauma becomes environmental, and where loneliness feels inseparable from exploration. Another major reason Evil Tonight feels connected to Alundra is its visual identity. A lot of players describe Evil Tonight as feeling like a lost PlayStation 1 or Game Boy Advance era game. And that's not just nostalgia. There's something very specific about the way late 90s games balance tone. They often combined cute sprite art, dark storytelling, oppressive atmosphere, and surprisingly mature themes. Alundra existed in that exact space, visually colorful but emotionally dark, adventurous on the surface but deeply unsettling underneath. And Evil Tonight recreates that balance almost perfectly. Its pixel art feels warm and expressive, but the environments are oppressive. The monsters are grotesque, but the world still feels strangely human. That contrast is incredibly important because many modern indie horror games tend to lean in one direction, either minimal psychological horror or retro gore nostalgia. But games from the PS1 era often mix genres together more freely: adventure, puzzle solving, RPG systems, survival horror, and emotional storytelling, all blended together. And Evil Tonight feels like it belongs to that forgotten design philosophy, not just aesthetically, but structurally. It feels like a modern indie game trying to imitate retro horror, and more like an actual lost game from an alternate timeline. That sensation is incredibly powerful for players who miss that era. Another major connection between the two games is their philosophy towards difficulty. Alundra was notoriously demanding. Its platforming required precision. Its puzzles demanded observation and patience. Progress often depended on mastery rather than accessibility. The game expected effort from the players, and Evil Tonight operates the same way. Ammo is limited, enemies are dangerous, healing resources matter, mistakes have consequences. You cannot casually brute force your way through every encounter. That friction is essential because both games treat survival as something earned. Modern games often prioritize smoothness, flow, and constant progression, but Alundra and Evil Tonight are willing to make the player uncomfortable, and that discomfort creates immersion. You do not simply move through these worlds, you endure them. That distinction matters because hardship makes environments feel dangerous and real. Every resource matters, every mistake matters, and every victory feels meaningful precisely because the game refused to make success effortless. There's also something harder to explain emotionally. Both Alundra and Evil Tonight feel strangely isolated from modern gaming trends. Alundra is often described as one of the best Zelda like games ever made, yet it never became a massive franchise. It feels like a forgotten masterpiece from a branch of game design that disappeared. and Evil Tonight creates the same feeling. It feels like a survival horror path the industry abandoned years ago. Not fully a survival horror, not fully an RPG, not fully an adventure game. It is something in between, something experimental. And because modern games rarely chase that specific mixture anymore, discovering Evil Tonight feels almost uncanny, like finding a hidden relic from an era that no longer exists. That emotional reaction is difficult to manufacture intentionally, but when it happens, players immediately recognize it. The game feels familiar in a way they can't fully articulate, not because it copies Alundra directly, but because it revives the same emotional texture. What makes Evil Tonight scratch that Alundra itch is not genre similarity, it's emotional philosophy. Both games believe exploration should feel tense. Both games build worlds shaped by sadness and lingering trauma. Both demand patience, observation, and mastery. Both create detailed pixel art environments that feel beautiful and oppressive at the same time. And both capture something many modern games avoid: the feeling of vulnerability inside the mysterious world that does not fully care whether you survive. That is what made the Lundra unforgettable, and that is why Evil Tonight feels so special to the people who miss that era. It doesn't simply imitate old games, it revives a lost emotional atmosphere. The feeling of discovering a dangerous melancholic world and surviving it through attention, endurance, and understanding. A world that feels haunted not just by monsters, but by memory itself. Now, in horror games, the monsters are usually the focus. But in Resident Evil, the Spencer Mansion isn't just a spooky backdrop, but a character within the game. I am Existential Thinker. Thanks for watching.